Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this Congressional Black Caucus Foundation event, Epicenter of the Eviction Crisis, Black Women's Fight for Health, Housing, and Education. I'm proud to host and convene this conversation. We have a powerful panel lined up. I'm proud to introduce Lisa Owens, Executive Director of Boston's own City Life Vita Urbana, a housing justice organization protecting working class communities from displacement. Carol Fife is the Director of Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, Oakland's organizer of Moms for Housing, and overall freedom fighter, cementing collective power for tenants in her community and throughout our country. And last but certainly not least, we have educator, advocate, and now Congressman-elect Jamal Bowman, who knows firsthand the trauma eviction wreaks on our nation's youth. To paraphrase sociologist Matthew Desmond, in poor Black communities, eviction is to women what mass incarceration is to men. To be clear, it's not a matter of, are you your brother's keeper, or are you your sister's keeper? This is not an either or, but an and. Our destinies and our freedoms are tied. But it is Black women, like those leading Moms for Housing, that are occupying vacant buildings, and Black women physically blocking landlords from entering housing court, literally putting their bodies on the line to protect what should be guaranteed for every family, housing. What Black women are experiencing today is a crisis within a crisis, a housing crisis where we are twice as likely to be evicted, a public health crisis where we are 3 times more likely to die of coronavirus, an economic crisis where we are twice as likely to be furloughed and 30% more likely to be out of work, an education crisis where our children are more likely to attend schools least equipped to transition to remote learning, and a subsequent childcare crisis because as the main breadwinners in our families, we still have to work. These crises were not unpredictable, and they most certainly were not inevitable. What we are experiencing is the culmination of decades of divestment from our communities and blatant disregard for our lived experiences in policy and decision-making. The 2008 financial crisis was a Great Depression level event for Black Americans, wiping out decades of gains in home ownership. Today, Black home ownership is at its lowest rate since the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And as a result, many former homeowners became renters, and by 2018, nearly 60% of Black households rented their home. In the last crisis, we were told the choice was between financial institutions and foreclosed homeowners, and we chose to bail out the big banks. In this moment, facing an unprecedented financial cliff, an eviction tsunami for Black women across the country, we must choose differently. That's why I introduced the Public Health Emergency Shelter Act, providing billions in emergency funding for those experiencing homelessness. In partnership with Senator Harris and Representative DeLauro, I introduced the Housing Emergencies Lifeline Act, HELP, to guarantee a right to counsel for all those at risk of eviction, many of whom have been threatened with illegal eviction during this economic crisis. This is just one additional layer of protection supplementing other necessary supports. I've also been calling for months for robust rental assistance and cancellation of rent and mortgage payments, a nationwide eviction and foreclosure moratorium, extension of expanded unemployment benefits, and universal, direct, reoccurring payments for the duration of this crisis. That is the bare minimum. Anything less is a question of political will, not resources. Black women have proven that we will take to the streets and demand greater justice for all. Make no mistake, eviction is an issue of racial justice, a civil rights issue that cuts across all others: healthcare, education, and employment. I've always said that those closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. Today's discussion is no different. So before I turn it over to our panelists, I do just want to acknowledge that indeed Black lives do matter and Black staffers matter as well. And I would like to thank the two Black women in my team who helped to put this together, Erin Douglas and Aya Ibrahim. And now we will get to our esteemed panelists, beginning with Lisa Owens, who will introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Representative Presley. And thank you for inviting me to be on a panel of people who I am really in awe of, actually. As you mentioned, I'm the director of City Life Vida Urbana, a housing justice organization in Massachusetts. We serve the greater Boston area. Our mission is to fight for racial, social, economic, and gender justice by building working class power. And our membership is made up of mostly Black women, and lots of our members are people who are seniors on fixed incomes, or conversely, young parents with small children. And so we work to stop displacement. We work to build community power, and we do this through a very innovative method, which we call our sword and our shield method, which really just pairs community organizing, things like telling our stories, learning our legal rights, and standing up for ourselves and our neighbors. And we pair that with really creative legal partnerships with civil legal aid in our state. So I'm super excited to be here to talk about this issue. And again, thank you for highlighting the role of evictions in Black communities. And I'll pass it over to Carol.
Thank you. My name is Carol Fife. I am the director of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. And I'm also one of the co-founders and organizers behind Moms for Housing. And our membership organization, ACE, is identical to what I've heard so far. We are a social justice organization that is membership based, and we focus on social, racial, and economic justice. We engage not only in electoral campaigns because we are a C4, but our nonprofit organizing allows us to get in communities and do education and just do some of the work that is necessary to build power in our communities. But we are also deeply, deeply entrenched into civil disobedience, as John Lewis would call good trouble. So a lot of the things that you see my organization engaged in is the good trouble that causes and creates change. And it is all centered and led by the people that are closest to the pain. So as we saw with Moms for Housing, a group of unsheltered and housing insecure mothers, because they had no other options to find housing, were able to change the entire narrative about who was deserving and made international news about occupying a space to bring attention to the housing crisis in California. I look forward to a deeper conversation around this particular issue and the impacts on Black women in the Black community. And I will pass it to Congressman-elect Bowman.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for including me in this discussion. It's a real honor to be joined by so many leaders in the community around this issue. Before I became Congressman-elect, I worked in public education for 20 years. I started my career as an elementary school teacher before becoming a high school guidance counselor and then becoming the founding principal of my own middle school in the Northeast Bronx. And I've had the privilege of working in what we call Title I schools. These are schools located in historically neglected communities. And one of the things I want to mention that I know we're going to talk about as we go forward is how housing insecurity is not a new phenomenon in our communities. It's connected to policy that has been racist for quite some time, and it works in alignment with historical trauma that Black women have dealt with in America throughout American history. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, and look forward to a deeper discussion.
All right. Well, I know we have a lot of ground to cover, so I just want to jump right in. You've already gotten us warmed up, and Jamal, I really appreciate your highlighting the impact of intersectional institutional structural racism and oppression. and the confluence of all those things and how those show up in our lives, and especially in this moment of unprecedented hurt as we are navigating 3 crises. But I want to begin with you, Lisa. City Life Vida Urbana recently released a widely cited report that found that most evictions that were filed in Boston during this pandemic were in neighborhoods of color. But this was true pre-crisis. You know, this is why we continue to take issue with those that say they look forward to our returning to normal, because we know that that normal was one that was already insufficient, unjust, and inadequate. I think we were seeing something like 3.7 million eviction filings a year, and that being disproportionately borne by Black households. So Lisa, how have you seen eviction filings used to police and to punish Black and brown renters? Speaking of intersectional oppression, as we're in this moment of a national reckoning on racial injustice, and speaking specifically about the under-resourcing of our communities, but the over-surveillance and the criminalization of our communities. So how have you seen eviction filings used to police and punish Black and brown renters, Lisa?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as you mentioned, we did a report about a year and a half ago. We were doing this research, and we released this research a couple of months ago, which surprised nobody in our communities, but for some reason, people outside of the Black community were shocked to see, one, that 70% of all market rate eviction filings in the city of Boston were happening in neighborhoods where people of color live. And in particular, Black communities were 2 times more likely to be experiencing eviction than any other place. So again, that wasn't a shock to us. We live this every day. It also probably though makes sense to put this in a little bit of context. Boston is a working class city surrounded by enclaves of higher income, white sort of suburban areas. But in Boston proper, and Boston is majority people of color. So it's very important to situate that. 52% of our households in Boston are eligible for some form of affordable housing. 39% of us are considered low or very low income. And we have one of the most expensive rental markets in the country. And as you mentioned, after the foreclosure crisis, we saw corporations snapping up rental housing stock that was formerly owned by working class families, and Black families were the hardest hit in the entire state, which meant a loss of Black generational wealth. And so in place of that working class Black ownership, home ownership, we actually saw corporations making speculative housing purchases and operating under a business model that favored wholesale displacement of families, of grandmothers, of moms and pops and children, whole families and entire buildings. And why? So that they could jack up the rent to levels where no working class family could ever afford. And so that had, as you can imagine, the impact of the last recession had a disproportionate impact on Black families, and in particular on Black women. And so now thinking about that context, because we know that evictions, as you said, are a civil rights issue, are a racial justice issue, it's important to understand how evictions impact the family. So evictions are, as we all know, a profoundly destabilizing experience that impacts every single member of the family. It impacts the health and well-being of families, of our neighborhoods, of the cities that our neighborhoods are embedded in. Families who experience eviction frequently have a hard time finding new stable housing. This is something that's important if you think about how evictions punish families. So if you receive an eviction notice, then you will likely have a hard time finding another stable place to live. Why is that? Well, because in our state, once you get evicted, you have a publicly available record in housing court. And so this is particularly disturbing because so many evictions are so-called no fault, or what we call evictions for profit. So that means that landlords now can use these so-called no fault evictions that is publicly available to screen out applicants that are undesirable. And we know that undesirable has often historically meant code for Black people. A formal eviction can also disqualify renters from many affordable housing programs. And once you are evicted, you lose, and you don't have access to housing in your neighborhood. You lose access to all of the supports that your families rely on: childcare, school, doctors, healthcare centers, not to mention our jobs and our the social supports that we use to backfill gaps. And then lastly, evictions lead to homelessness. So we know that there's a report that our study cites that says people who experience displacement are 5 times more likely to apply to a homeless shelter. So all of this is punishing. These are systemic impacts, and we'll talk later on about how we got to this. We'll talk more about systemic racism, but these are very concrete ways that this system punishes Black women and punishes Black families.
Thank you, Lisa. And you know, Jamal, I'm gonna go to you, just picking up on building on Lisa's point around the fact that this is incredibly destabilizing to, you know, an entire household and to our communities. Can you speak a little bit about your experience as an educator, Jamal, and what you have seen on the front lines? I remember reading a statistic in my advocacy as a Boston City councilor for socio-emotional wellness supports in our schools, that displacement and the trauma inflicted upon that is akin to the trauma that our students, at that time, there were about 4,000 students experiencing homelessness in our school district in Boston. It's akin to that the trauma of experiencing homelessness is akin to the same trauma experienced with displacement. And we had many young people who had experienced as many as 8 displacements. I think Boston is currently the 3rd most gentrifying city in the country. So Jamal, just speak a little bit about those intersections, and given the potential displacement and eviction tsunami that we find ourselves on the precipice of, what would displacement of 30 to 40 million Americans mean for our nation's education system, to our children?
It would mean chaos. It would mean a growing of the achievement gap, the so-called achievement gap that has been in place for decades. What we need to understand is this trauma that we're talking about as it relates to housing insecurity, it's a compounded trauma, because it's not just housing insecurity. It's often connected to job insecurity and economic insecurity, which is also connected to food insecurity within communities that have been historically neglected. And this is not just a trauma that's happening in the moment. This is generational trauma connected to federal policy like redlining, which created communities of concentrated poverty and concentrated trauma. And there have been studies that have shown trauma is not just about being stressed out. When we talk about trauma at this level, we're talking about toxic stress and chronic trauma. And when it happens to children under the age of 18, there are biological effects based on the trauma that our children are experiencing. So when we talk, not just biological effects, effects to the immune system. So this trauma doesn't just lead to bad education outcomes, but it leads to negative health and economic outcomes across the lifespan. But in our schools, where we're failing is we're not understanding that and then investing more in school counselors or social workers or school psychologists or more teachers to lower class size. We're investing more in police, and we're investing more in school safety. And we're investing more in assistant principals that deal with punitive measures and discipline. So when we talk about not just the achievement gap, which will persist if we don't deal with this issue of housing and food and economic insecurity, we're also talking about the school to prison pipeline and the high suspension rates that we see in our schools, beginning as young as, with children as young as 4 or 5 years old. So this trauma that our children are dealing with, they're bringing it into the schools, and they're hungry, they're stressed, they're frustrated. Our teachers aren't trained in trauma-informed practices. So the first thing they do is they tell a student to go to the principal's office or the dean's office or somewhere where their trauma is not being dealt with. And instead of it being dealt with, they're being suspended from school. And the last thing I'll say is, because of the stress that they're dealing with outside of school, it's harder for them to concentrate in their academic classes. So add to that underfunded schools, so they're stressed out in classrooms that are overcrowded because their schools are underfunded, and because we're not dealing with them from a social and emotional and mental health perspective, and we're dealing with them from a punitive perspective, they're more likely to be suspended from school. And one last thing, when we underfund schools, we take away the arts. We take away physical education. We take away sports. And these are the areas needed most to help kids deal with stress, to help families deal with stress. They need to harness that negative energy and channel it towards sports, the arts, and creative spaces where they could use that energy and what's going on in their lives more productively.
Absolutely. And I thank you as a candidate for endorsing my People's Justice Guarantee, which is about decriminalizing those experiencing homelessness, poverty, et cetera. I can't wait till you take an oath of office and I can get you on as a co-sponsor of my bill, counseling, not criminalization in our schools, as well as my bill with Representative Omar to end the push-out crisis and to address what is the growing criminalization of Black girls in our schools. So thank you for all the ways in which you spoke to this impact on our public health outcomes, our economic and social mobility, our educational outcomes, and just again, it's a conflated series of crises. And so thank you for contextualizing that. Carol, I want to turn to you because both Jamal and Lisa were speaking to the fact that, these things, these injustices, these racial disparities, they didn't just happen. And I have, many colleagues that I think that are calloused and disconnected from the hardships that our families experience, but also that poverty was legislated. Poverty is a policy choice, right? This has nothing to do with bootstraps. There has been disproportionate hate, hurt, and harm foisted on to Black Americans through lawmaking. And so the path forward is one where we must be disruptive in our lawmaking to, instead of legislating hurt, to legislate justice and healing and equity. And so the two things, Carol, I'd love for you to speak to is one of the reasons why I think people were surprised when they heard those statistics from the Vida Life, City Life Vida Urbana report, is that they tend to marginalize these issues. They tend to dog whistle and racist trope, who's impacted by these issues. So speak to, as an organizer of Moms for Housing, what sort of assumptions and myths need to be dispelled? And then when it comes to lawmaking and political will, what are some of the produced material improvements that you've seen on the state and local level that we should be looking to replicate on the federal level?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that we saw that was a consistent narrative coming from people that were in opposition was this story of these women that were standing up not only for themselves and their families, but for people, not just Black people either, but the individuals as a whole that are struggling for housing, are that these women were somehow lazy. They were somehow, just trying to get something for free, that they were criminals and on drugs and with mental health issues. All of the stereotypes that we hear about Black people in general and Black women in specific being welfare queens, but there's a variety of individuals that engaged in this particular civil disobedience action. There are moms with college degrees, moms who've run for public office and are deeply civically engaged, that do food giveaway programs consistently in community and are just a part of the fabric of our city. So I think the narrative that was tried to, that they tried to attach to these mothers and stigmatize them really ended up backfiring, because people saw themselves in this struggle. Everyone has a mother, whether you know her, whether you have a relationship with her. Everyone saw themselves in the need and struggle for affordable housing, because as Boston, Oakland, and the San Francisco Bay Area are some of the most expensive places to live in the country, where the, well, not just Oakland, but no one in the United States of America can afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment at fair market value. No one working a minimum wage job could be able to afford it. They would have to work 97 hours a week to afford the median 2-bedroom apartment. And because we're seeing that this is an issue in the East Bay, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Boston, and Los Angeles, and Texas, we can say that this is not just a fluke. This is legislated. It is policy. It is a practice that is intentional, because it's reproducing the same impact in every single state across the nation. So some of the things that I've seen that have been beneficial in Oakland is the ability to have community ownership of land. The speculative nature of housing has put it out of reach for most working class Americans. And we've seen that nonprofits who actually steward the land and are able to purchase it and own it in perpetuity can offer it at affordable rates to individuals like the moms. That's what happened in the Mom's House scenario. The Oakland Community Land Trust was able to purchase the home and now can offer it to low-income families for as long as they own the land. So that is one of the things that's been really important. We also pushed for a permanent affordability fund from a bond measure that was passed in my city. And we're able to give allocations of $300,000 that came from this infrastructure bond in order to protect tenants who were at risk of displacement to be able to purchase their home from their owner, many of which were in the speculative market. So I think in order to address this, we have got to address the speculative nature and the commodification of housing, because that is one of the primary ways that we'll be able to ensure that people always have a place to live. As long as housing is sold to the highest bidder, it will consistently put housing out of reach for African Americans who lost the majority of their wealth and housing stock with the last financial crisis. So moving forward, because we are on this cliff where people are also potentially going to lose their rental spaces, which they lost their homes in 2008, but now rentals, we are on the verge of a huge catastrophe that will primarily impact Black folks where I live. And I know if it's true where I live, it's true all across the country, that we've got to engage in policy solutions that will protect our residents. I'm really excited about your legislation. Happy to be a supporter of that. And there are congresspeople like Elizabeth Warren and others, Bernie Sanders, who are also trying to put forward policy that will do just that, which is protect the most vulnerable in our country.
Thank you. And, I want to stay in this policy vein because I want to make sure that Jamal and I have our marching orders, but also since we know that these crises, these injustices are not occurring in silos, there is that intersectionality. And so we can't legislate in silos either. And so we also want to make sure that we continue to engage our partners on the municipal and state level. And so, Lisa, I'd love to hear from you if you would be willing to just enumerate some of what you've seen actually have an impact. My mother was a tenants' rights organizer, in full disclosure, may she rest in peace and power. I grew up in my formative years in Cabrini. She was a tenants' rights organizer under the Urban League of Chicago. And so she taught me early on that we get what we organize for. So what do we need to be organizing for when it comes to state and local government? And what are the marching orders that you would give Jamal and I on the federal level when it comes to our recovery from these conflated public health and economic and racial injustice crises, navigating all three of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I also just want to say how excited we are about the legislation that you were talking about, Representative Presley. What it would mean for for Black families, for Black women, for Black seniors, for Black children, for Black fathers, what it would mean for working class people to know that they are protected from all of the negative impacts of displacement that come from eviction or foreclosure due to COVID-19 related reasons. The relief, and the ability to dig ourselves out of the hole, of the financial economic hole that we were put in because of the compounding nature of the pandemics that we were talking about. So I can't say more strongly enough how important it is for this legislation to pass. And likewise, right to counsel, tenant option to purchase, these are policies that we need at the federal level. And while you fight at the federal level, organizations like ours are fighting with our own state representatives in Boston and Massachusetts to try to carve out some protections. So there's a COVID-19 emergency housing guarantee bill that is pending right now in the Massachusetts State House. And we are urging everybody in Massachusetts to continue the fight to make sure that working class families across the Commonwealth have an extension of the eviction and foreclosure moratorium that our governor recently just extended. But we have a piece of legislation that would make those protections last for a year past our state of emergency and add additional protections specifically for working class homeowners that in addition to missed mortgage payments, they have water and sewer and taxes and all of these bills that they need to pay. So it would create a fund that would target working class folks, seniors, nonprofits that are dealing with the families that need it the most. And on the renter side, it would do things like just cause eviction, freezing rents to pre-COVID-19 levels, so that we can again begin to dig ourselves out of this hole so that we can have a real recovery. And then lastly, I just want to say, Carol, how excited we were. We were following your struggle in Boston. We also have a community land trust that was born from the foreclosure crisis. Black families occupied our homes as well and fought the big banks and were able to wrest control of 15 units of housing. We kept it in the Black community and we created a community land trust. And so we really see your effort as a sister effort to us. And we also know that at the state level and also at the federal level, there need to be resources for the creation and expansion of community land trusts for all of the reasons that you were saying. We need to take housing out of the speculative market and put it under the control of working class communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And Jamal, you mentioned redlining earlier, and that's certainly, as a member of the Financial Services Committee, one of the things that we're fighting for is the modernization of the Community Reinvestment Act. The fact that something like 98% of our financial institutions continue to pass those CRAs when we know the practice of redlining still persists. So in that vein, Jamal, if you would speak to and other folks can chime in, how has the deterioration of fair housing protections contributed to this crisis?
You know, it's interesting. You know, my mortgage is through Wells Fargo, and I got that mortgage prior to learning and understanding Wells Fargo's discriminatory practices against Black people and communities of color. So the discrimination persists. It persists with realtors, it persists with banks, it persists throughout the private industry. And this is where the federal government has to step in this moment to make massive investments in housing infrastructure for renters and to support Black families in buying homes. This is where the conversation of reparations comes up. This is where the conversation in relation to Ilhan Omar's bill, looking to invest $1 trillion over the next 10 years to build 12 million new social housing units that will be some form of cooperative and will include some form of community land trust as well. We need ownership in our communities. We need massive investments in our communities through reparations and the federal government needs to step in and get this done finally. You know, we put forth a reconstruction agenda and what I've been arguing is hopefully the third time will be a charm, because the first time, you know, after slavery, we never got our 40 acres. And instead the Homestead Act was passed and whites, both foreign born and native born, were given millions of acres of land to build homes and begin to build wealth. The same thing happened with the New Deal, and it continues to happen, and Black folks have been kept out of that conversation. So this is why we're pushing for truth and reconciliation as part of our Reconstruction agenda, and we're pushing for reparations as part of that agenda as well, so we can invest in not just housing infrastructure, but education and all of the other areas that we've discussed, because it hasn't been done, and reparations have been given to other groups, and we've been kept out, and no longer is this something that we're going to allow ourselves to be kept out of. This is a time for bold action and bold demands, and it's going to take continued organizing and the work of Lisa and Carol and others, which is super exciting to get this done at a federal level.
Thank you, Jamal. And Carol, I wonder if you'd speak to, and it's just, you know, it's good to be with all of you. It is fortifying and restorative, insightful, and this is the sort of verbiage that and discourse I wish I could have engaged with when Secretary Carson was before the Financial Services Committee. I could not even. This is someone who clearly thinks that being poor is a character flaw, and you know, has again the rollbacks to our fair housing laws and protections, just stunning. And certainly housing is a critical determinant of health, which is why I did introduce the Public Health Emergency Shelter Act. It is just unconscionable, since housing is a human right, but especially in the midst of a public health crisis, a pandemic, that we would be displacing or evicting people. Carol, could you just speak to what is the impact on the public health? I mean, notwithstanding the pandemic, but the pre-crisis crisis, you know, how critical is access to safe, affordable housing to the public health?
It is so critical. And I recently rewatched your testimony to Carson, and I was just in awe of you and some of the things that you brought up, because housing is health. One of the mothers that stayed in mom's house daily had a 1-year-old. He wasn't one at the time, but he turned 1 while living in the house and took his first steps living in that house because he finally had the space to move his legs. Her daughter was you don't recognize these symptoms in children unless you're really looking for them, but was completely disinterested in school. But when she had her own bedroom and a bed to sleep in every single night, she would come and tell us how she was doing her work now. And she was excited to go to school and to thrive and to do well. But before that, complete disinterest. And those are just a couple of the ways. And because there are so many intersectional variables that are compounded on Black life, including health, education, environment. Environment is a huge factor, because oftentimes in the neighborhoods where we're relegated to where we're being gentrified out of, the environment is a factor where people, the pollution in the air and in the water, and even in our schools, is impacting the ability of young people to achieve. I'm also a former educator, and you can see when housing is unstable, when people, even in their living conditions, don't have access to running water, or they're living in their cars, the impact that has on future generations, which is why in Desmond's book, when he talks about evictions being similar to mass incarceration, it's because of the impact that that has on the development of children and the trauma that is passed down generation by generation. So in the same way that we saw that the Homestead Act and the New Deal actually left Black people out of the equation, it's important that we have a Black New Deal that recognizes the failures of policy and the racist policy and the structures and the systems, because that's what we're talking about. The way that systems are structured to antagonize and keep Black folks from actually achieving their greatest good. And until we address the original sin of this country and its racist history, then it'll be really challenging to address the future. And education is such a big part of that. We're miseducated in our public school systems, which is why you can make achievement a personal act. If you don't talk about all of the historic ways that we've been kept from achieving access to employment and same equal pay and access to jobs and education and real estate and all of these different things, then you can point to, well, that's just them. They're not equipped to be able to thrive in this country because there's something that they're doing wrong. No, the systems are wrong. They're not broken. They're working exactly as they've been designed to work. And we need to change the systems. And our elected representatives are duty bound to address those needs, because it's been governmental actions in concert with the private industry that's allowed these situations and these systems to recreate themselves.
Absolutely. I'm just curious, does anyone have any thoughts on, and you mentioned equal pay. So again, we can't legislate in a vacuum here. And so some might not make the correlation, but if Black women are getting paid, 54, I think that's the latest number, right? 54 cents on the dollar, what is the impact of that over time? Carol, are you supportive of rent control? Is that something that you all have in Oakland? Do you think that would have an impact?
I am in support of rent control, and I know a lot of people tend to say that there is no evidence that it works, but in Oakland, we have evidence that it works. And typically the people that are saying that it doesn't are deeply connected to the real estate industry. So rent control, and we actually have to repeal Costa-Hawkins in the state of California to make rent control universal, but it has saved people's lives. When you get a rent increase of 50% and you can no one's income is going up the percentages that the amounts of rents are going up. So we need some kind of legislation to protect people from these 50%, 105% can mean the difference between people being homeless and being sheltered, especially for our seniors. We're seeing seniors that are being put out onto the streets because of minor rent increases. So we have to have some kind of program that caps how much renters have to pay in these arbitrary rent increases, because those are becoming structural evictions to many renters across the state of California. And I'm sure it's true for the country.
Yeah. Lisa, can you pick up on that? I think, Carol, you had said that in your folks would have to work 97 hours to afford one median or sort of one market rent apartment. Lisa, I think in Boston it's 84 hours, right? I think that might have been what your report spoke to. But Lisa, I thank you for supporting, endorsing our legislation, the Housing Emergencies Lifeline Program, the HELP Act. Can you speak a little bit of, again, this is just one more layer of protections for renters. We know this is not, we're trying to pull and exact every lever. This is not a matter of or, it's a matter of and. And so this is one more layer of tenant protections. But Lisa, could you speak to, how many people do you think are evicted just because they are not aware of their rights and don't have legal representation? What are those percentages?
So we have our report talks about formal legal evictions. And we know that 70% of formal legal evictions are happening in communities of color, disproportionately in Black communities. But what we also know through the organizing is that that number is a small percentage of the actual number of people who are being displaced informally with so-called self-help evictions. And the major reason is because people do not know their rights, and landlords don't have any incentive to tell people their rights, right? And so that's one. And then secondly, when evictions actually do make it to court, which, as I just want to highlight, very rarely happens if you don't know your rights. You just pack up and leave. But once you do, if you don't have a landlord, if you don't have a lawyer, and right now the numbers are so skewed, 90% of landlords have lawyers, and something like 5% of tenants have lawyers. If you don't have a lawyer, then you are almost certainly going to be evicted from your home. But if you do have a lawyer, the studies show that the likelihood of you being able to stay in your home jumps up to about 90%. So it's very, very important for people to know their rights. It's very important for us to have legal protections in place that provide things like right to counsel. It's very important for, at the state and the federal level, that we have a comprehensive set of packages that both deepen protections for tenants and then create the structural opportunities that Carol is talking about. Things like investment in community land trusts, things like investments, special investments for working class homeowners, particularly Black homeowners, and other sorts of policies that really both stabilize housing and redress all of the systemic harms that were done intentionally to our communities.
Thank you. Well, I wish that we had more time, but we are running short on it. I am so grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you. I'm grateful for your leadership, grateful for your insight. Thank you for your bringing always your lived experiences to whatever table you're at, whatever room you're in. And as we said at the beginning of this discussion, our eviction crisis is the result of decades of intentional policy choices, prioritizing certain communities at the expense of our communities. So just as policy choices perpetuated the inequities leading us to this crisis, policymaking which affirms safe and reliable housing as a basic human right is what will lead us forward. I'm proud to call all of our panelists and all of you participating today virtually partners in this work, as my mother would say, with a capital W. And I look forward to working together to end the trauma of evictions in our communities and finally affirming housing justice for all. Thank you for joining us.